Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. President John F. Kennedy's call to action still rings true. In a faraway place, now long ago, 2.5 million American soldiers answered their country's call. As the nation faltered, they kept the faith. They fought and died in our country's longest war, the war in Vietnam. Our soldiers would finally come home to discover that they'd lost the war. For over a quarter century, that's what we've all been told. But there are many who believe that there was a time that the war was won. This is their story.
Since you had fought and won all your battles and you come home and find we're losing the war, you get a little disturbed about that.
I do not think it would be realistic to expect that people who have staked out one position on the war and made their professional reputations defending that position for a quarter century or more are going to be swayed by new evidence.
The image that is a reflection of the Vietnam War, and those who grew up with the disenchantment of the Vietnam years is in the process of changing.
But I do think that a younger generation without that baggage might be open to the evidence and reach different, and I would say sounder conclusions about the nature of the war and the major factors that shaped it and the possibilities.
Heavy American commitment in Vietnam began in the autumn of 1964, culminating in a temporary ceasefire nearly a decade later. However, this was not the first time that the strategic importance of Southeast Asia had helped to draw the United States into a major conflict. By early 1941, prior to American entry into World War II, relations with Japan had reached a crisis point. After occupying Korea and Manchuria and brutally attacking China, the Japanese military had set their sights on Southeast Asia. Declassified documents now reveal President Roosevelt's growing anxiety over the increased Japanese influence in Indochina, principally northern and southern Vietnam. On February 14, 1941, referring to the movements of Japan southward down to Indochina, FDR told the Japanese ambassador that the American people are seriously concerned at the course of Japan. Just 6 months later, on August 19, 1941, in another classified exchange with the Japanese ambassador, the president stated, "Japan has continued its military activities and has occupied Indochina with its military, air, and naval forces. This government now finds it necessary to say to the government of Japan that if the Japanese government takes any further steps in pursuance of a policy or program of military domination, the government of the United States will be compelled to take immediately any and all steps which it may deem necessary." In a last-ditch effort, FDR appealed directly to the Emperor of Japan on December 6, 1941. During the last few weeks, it has become clear to the world that Japanese military, naval, and air forces have been sent to southern Indochina. It is clear that a continuance of such a situation is unthinkable. President Roosevelt was answered just hours later. On Sunday morning, December 7th, 1941, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. Nazi Germany declared war on the U.S. the following week. Thus, the American people, reluctant to directly engage in the conflict that had been raging in Europe, were now galvanized to action in the Pacific. The final trigger point we now know was Vietnam. In 1945, as the World War ended in victory over Japan and Germany, the people of Western Europe, Australia, and large portions of Asia were freed from domination. But it was soon apparent that the cause of freedom had left others behind. Our former ally, the Soviet Union, swept millions of Eastern Europeans under communist control, while the people of China suffered a similar fate. Anxious to exert their new influence, the communists began a campaign to subvert and replace governments around the world. The United States was equally determined that the sacrifices of World War II would not be in vain. Thus began a 40-year succession of crisis and conflict that came to be known as the Cold War. The first major outbreak of the Cold War came in June 1950, when the North Korean army attacked over the World War II dividing line. The Soviet-backed and communist Chinese-trained North Koreans quickly overran the South's defenders. Only a bold American invasion at Incheon that September helped to turn the tide against the communists. The Korean War dragged on for over 2 more years, until an armistice was finally signed in July 1953. The agreement would divide the country along the 38th parallel, right where it had been when the fighting had begun. Almost 37,000 American servicemen had died. In Europe, just as the Korean War was being settled, the East German people rioted against their new communist rulers, and thousands fled to the West and freedom. The communists could not tolerate this rejection of their system and erected the Berlin Wall, permanently dividing the former German capital. Meanwhile, events were playing out that would once again involve the United States in Southeast Asia. With arms and supplies from the Soviet Union and China, the North Vietnamese had defeated their former French colonial masters at Dien Bien Phu in a 9-year conflict they called the First Vietnam War. The Korean War had ended only a year earlier with curious similarity. Signed in 1954, the peace treaty ending this early conflict divided Vietnam in half as well, the communist North and the democratic South. Feeling betrayed by the agreement, the North Vietnamese leaders were also outraged at losing control of the fertile Mekong Delta. At their head was Nguyen That Tan, a Soviet protege who had returned to fight the French after a 30-year absence. A master of intrigue, he took the name Ho Chi Minh for Ho, the Enlightened One. Ho wasted little time in ordering his surviving soldiers to secretly infiltrate South Vietnam. Beginning with Eisenhower, Ho would face 4 successive and determined American presidents. In 1961, in Germany, John F. Kennedy laid out a challenge to totalitarian regimes like North Vietnam in the famous "I Am a Berliner" speech.
There are many people in the world who really don't understand, or say they don't, what is the great issue between the free world and the communist world. Let them come to Berlin.
As the communist attacks on South Vietnam increased, Kennedy was there to oppose them. Thus, only 20 years after President Roosevelt's confrontation with Japan over Vietnam, the sons of the World War II generation were drawn into the greatest struggle of the Cold War. The conflict came to a disheartening close in 1975, when the Northern Communists overran the Southern Republic. But was the war really lost? Is it possible that the answer, like the war itself, is much more complex? A third-generation West Point graduate, biographer and historian Louis Sorley commanded an armor unit in Vietnam.
The nature of the war was such that both the South Vietnamese forces that were there and the American forces that went to help them were engaging several different types of enemies, maybe simultaneously. One was the Viet Cong, which were the southern guerrilla forces, the insurgents, if you will. One was the North Vietnamese forces, which were invading forces that came down from the north. And one was this sort of, we called it the infrastructure, the VCI sometimes, Viet Cong infrastructure, which was a clandestine set of people in the villages and hamlets of Vietnam, so that they were, through terroristic means, able to keep the people in the hamlets and villages pretty much under communist domination.
One of the things that has struck me about the history of the war as it's taught now, and the history of the war as you see on television, is the impression that the Americans started the large-scale fighting.
Merle Pribenow is a Vietnamese linguist and worked as a translator in the American Embassy in Saigon for 5 years. He has translated the Communists' published histories of the war.
In fact, the Vietnamese Communists in their own history state that their infiltration started many years before our introduction of ground forces. By the time American Marines landed at Da Nang in March of 1965, there were 4 North Vietnamese regiments in the central highlands of South Vietnam. So the idea that we started the war and we started the large-scale war is, from a Vietnamese communist perspective, even poppycock.
Vietnam had gotten a lot of attention in Washington in the early 60s, but the actual number of soldiers was not large. That would change on August 4th, 1964. Steaming in international waters off the coast of North Vietnam, the destroyer Maddox came under attack by North Vietnamese gunboats. Although there are conflicting reports on the events that day, it was the first time that the North Vietnamese leadership would directly confront the United States. President Johnson responded.
We have learned at a terrible and a brutal cost that retreat does not bring safety, and weakness does not bring peace. And it is this lesson that has brought us to Vietnam.
Exactly a year later, General William Westmoreland dedicated the Allied headquarters in Saigon, South Vietnam. General Westmoreland wanted lots of American soldiers and firepower to accomplish the mission as he saw it. His president gave him what he asked for. President Johnson's choice to command his new American commitment in Vietnam was General William C. Westmoreland. Already a combat veteran of World War II and Korea, General Westmoreland believed that the war in Vietnam should and could be fought in a similar manner.
In the years when General Westmoreland commanded in Vietnam, Americans concentrated primarily on combat operations and large-scale combat operations, usually in the deep jungle. And while that resulted in killing a lot of the enemy, it didn't have very much to do with bringing about a favorable outcome of the war.
General Westmoreland's approach did not recognize that the war needed both a military and political solution. Lower-level commanders were the first to recognize this dilemma. General Jack Cushman spent his first tour in 1963 as the chief advisor for the South Vietnamese 21st Infantry Division in the Mekong River Delta.
Now, the problem in South Vietnam is that there's one people and 2 governments. One government is the government in Saigon, with its province chiefs and district chiefs and chain of command down into the countryside. The other government is the Viet Cong. Their province chiefs are out there too. And they're competing for the same people that the government of Vietnam was competing for. And they were winning.
Under General Westmoreland, the Allies were destroying large numbers of the enemy. But there was still a lack of security for local Vietnamese in widespread areas of the country. Answering that challenge would require the development of a new structure under which Allied military and civilian operations would work together.
Bob Comer was called in by President Johnson who was very unhappy with the integration of the political and the military solutions, a civil-military link, where the State Department and civilian branches were doing the civil and the MACV was doing the military. And he appointed Comer, Bob Comer, who had been, I think, a consultant at Rand or someplace. He brought him into the White House and told him to get busy and figure out a way to link these two. And the result was the CORDS program.
Working together with the military, the joint effort with CORDS was usually referred to as the Pacification Program. Ambassador Charles Whitehouse was deputy commander for CORDS in 3 Corps.
The purpose of the pacification program was, in essence, to bring security and economic well-being by Vietnamese standards, and improved health and maintain education and do all the things for the population that needed to be done to assure their loyalty to their country, South Vietnam, and to repair the damage done by the war. In order to achieve that, we helped the South Vietnamese create what in effect was a militia. And Army officers who worked for me were advisors to them and assured the supply of boots, uniforms, mortars, ammunition, Band-Aids, you name it. Then at the same time, there were civilians working on introducing new strains of miracle rice, trying to get education restarted, trying to bring some engineering, get roads repaired, culverts that had been blown up, bridges that needed fixing.
CORDS and related programs delivered through U.S. aid enjoyed some early successes. However, there remained the challenge of fighting a complex enemy.
You're fighting the Viet Cong guerrillas, you're fighting the North Vietnamese invaders, but you're also fighting the clandestine infrastructure.
This clandestine infrastructure was known by a variety of names: Viet Cong Cadre, the Shadow Government, or just VC.
The strength of the Viet Cong insurgency, which began in 1960, resided ultimately in these Viet Cong cadres, the members of the Viet Cong Shadow Government who went to the South. These were primarily people who were trained in North Vietnam after the 1954 peace accords and then sent back into the South. And there were a number of reasons that they were effective in gaining control of villages. One of the reasons was that these were people who were charismatic. They also were effective because they came in and started assassinating a lot of the local officials. That had a number of effects. The principal effect, as far as the people were concerned, was to intimidate them. Now, they wouldn't go in and generally wipe out a whole village, but they'd kill off a few of the leaders and convince the people that if you cooperated with the government, this is what was going to happen to you. And it also eliminated a lot of the people who were the best resistance to the communists.
Thousands of innocent South Vietnamese civilians were being killed by the Viet Cong in their effort to terrorize and coerce the rural population. Something more effective was needed.
The Phoenix program was created in 1967 by the CIA. The idea behind the Phoenix program was that you needed to target the so-called Viet Cong Shadow Government, who were the people who were orchestrating the campaign on behalf of the Viet Cong inside the villages of South Vietnam. And these were the people who were recruiting, they were getting information from people. So the idea was that you would take all the different organizations that were working and try to get them to share their information. One of the misconceptions about the Phoenix program is that it initiated a new campaign of arrests and violence in the village. In reality, it was only coordinating a bunch of organizations that had already existed.
The fact that Phoenix was run by the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency made it automatically suspect on the part of some in Congress and the press. Alleged abuses under the Phoenix program grew into one of the great myths of the war.
Now, there's another part to the allegations that Phoenix was indiscriminate, and that is that people were killed indiscriminately, that forces on the government side would go into villages and just start shooting people up. they never went in and just started shooting civilians. The only time they shot people was in a military engagement. Almost always that engagement was not in a village. It might be near a village where they were waiting to ambush someone, but it was very risky to go and try to fight in a village, and usually the enemy wouldn't be there anyway.
But what real effect did all these efforts by Cords, Phoenix, and the local militia have on security in the countryside?
Overall, certainly, these programs had a major effect. And in addition to causing personnel losses for the Viet Cong, these programs shut off the access of the Viet Cong to the villages, so that further reduced their ability to intimidate or to collect rice or get information from the villagers. So that certainly had a major effect.
It did improve enormously the safety and well-being of the people in rural South Vietnam.
By late 1967, the structure for winning the war in the South was now in place. Joint civilian and military operations like Cords and the efforts to remove the Viet Cong infrastructure were having some effect. But the thousands of communist cadre that remained in the villages were a hindrance to any prospect for peace. The enemy was about to provide a solution. By 1967, General Westmoreland and President Johnson were reporting great progress to the American people. They had underestimated the enemy's resolve, but the enemy made mistakes of their own. In their all-out surprise attack of 1968, the communists' plan to seize the South was fundamentally flawed. What happened led to a major change in the war.
The character of the war changed dramatically as a result of the Tet Offensive, North Vietnamese Tet Offensive in the spring of 1968, winter of 1968. I think they made a gross strategic error from their standpoint. They decided that they could bring the Viet Cong out, they would rise up, and there'd be an uprising in the countryside and in the cities in particular, and the Viet Cong would then take over the cities and towns, particularly the larger ones, and the North Vietnamese troops would then be able to move in from the north and from Laos and Cambodia and so forth. That didn't happen.
The North Vietnamese Politburo, Resolution 14, which was adopted in January of 1968, formalized the decision to launch the offensive. There were supposed to be popular uprisings which would be stimulated by communist political organizers in the major cities, in Saigon, Da Nang, and Hue primarily. The military planning for the offensive was for military forces, mostly small forces on a battalion level, to move into the city to support the popular uprisings, to provide the guns necessary to help these mass demonstrations which would occupy government offices and take over the local administration. The communist military histories that are written after the war make it very clear that the military commanders on site had some real skepticism about these uprisings. They basically said what has been being planned from a military standpoint in the cities doesn't make sense.
The memoir of one communist commander tells a story that was typical of the disaster that awaited the attackers.
He was not told the date of the attack until less than 24 hours before the attack on Saigon. And his memoirs are incredible in his description of the scene when a couple of senior commanders showed up at his command post and said, "Your forces are to attack 20 hours from now. Attack Saigon 20 hours from now." He says all he could do at first was just stand there saying, "Oh my God." It just didn't make any sense. The theme in all of the histories that you see is The military forces got into the city and said, "Where are the civilians? Where are the people conducting the uprising? There's no one. We didn't meet anybody. We didn't hear anything. You know, what are we doing now?" So they fought. In many cases, they fought very hard, but they were on a suicide mission. They realized very quickly that they were on a suicide mission, and they didn't have a hope of success, and they were wiped out.
And in the process, they lost not only a whole lot of soldiers, thousands of soldiers of their Viet Cong soldiers, these are the guerrillas, but they also lost the infrastructure, the supporting people who supported those people, those soldiers no longer willing to support them because they had come out, tried to fight, gotten beaten, and so, well, we're not going to support that anymore. That changed the whole face of the war.
Having squandered their base of sympathizers and the bulk of their secret organization in the South, the Northern Communist leadership took another drastic step.
Replacement units were sent into local areas to try to rebuild an infrastructure. What that meant was that young North Vietnamese raw recruits, 17, 18-year-olds, were being sent into Delta villages to work as local guerrillas. Villages where their accent was different than the locals. Frequently, even their vocabulary was different. They didn't know the village, they didn't know the people, they didn't know anything, and they were supposed to be local guerrillas, and in fact, they were just cannon fodder. And they died in droves.
Ignoring the tremendous losses of the VC guerrillas, regular North Vietnamese army units engaged in the 1968 offensives found themselves ordered to a similar fate.
An expression was born in North Vietnam, which actually some of the recruits would have tattooed on their arms or whatever. The expression was Sinh Bắc Tử Nam, which means born in the North to die in the South. They knew that they weren't coming home.
So the dependence on popular uprisings virtually destroyed the South Vietnamese communist forces. The Northern leadership had given a huge boost to the Allied civilian efforts. Their desperate attacks would set in motion a critical change in Allied military command that would haunt them for years to come. The Communist forces made 3 separate attacks on the South during 1968. They had been decimated by the Allies, losing nearly 90,000 men in that year alone. The attacks were not successes, but they were ramifications in the United States.
Public support for the war took a nosedive in the wake of the Tet Offensive. On the battlefield, the enemy took enormous casualties, disproportionate to those of the friendly forces. So as a battlefield endeavor, Tet 68 was costly and did not succeed in the objectives the enemy had set forth, which were not only to win militarily, but to cause a general uprising of the population in support of his efforts to take over South Vietnam. That never happened.
Well, before the Tet Offensive in January of 1968, there was still a large base of communist personnel and communist supporters in the South. After Tet Offensive, that number declined dramatically, and then in May of '68, the communists launched what they called Mini-Tet, which was an attempt to recreate the Tet Offensive, and it was similarly disastrous. And there was yet a third in August of 1968. And as a result of all of those, the size of the communist movement in the South shrunk dramatically.
Their histories are pretty clear that after '68, the sole source of supplies and reinforcements was North Vietnam.
Further complicating the communist plans for conquest was a critical change in the American command, a new development the communists themselves had unwittingly precipitated.
All through 1967, Lyndon Johnson had been orchestrating what we later came to call a progress offensive to convince the American people that we were really making progress in Vietnam. And a principal instrument of that campaign was General Westmoreland, who returned to the United States 3 times during that year and spoke at a joint session of the Congress, spoke at the National Press Club, went on a television broadcast called Meet the Press, and said things like, "I have never been more encouraged in my 4 years in Vietnam," and things like, "We have reached a point where the end begins to come into view," and very optimistic things like that. So that when the Tet Offensive erupted, a lot of people concluded that either General Westmoreland did not know what he was talking about, or he hadn't been leveling with them.
Prior to the Communist Tet Offensive of 1968, the American civilian leadership had already begun their new war of pacification. Accords and the Phoenix Program, now both supervised by Ambassador William Colby, were in place as critical parts of that new plan. The military had a new direction too. All that was needed now was the right leader to drive it forward. General Creighton Abrams, a former tank commander and hero of World War II, was that man.
General Abrams knew exactly what he wanted to do and thought should be done, and he hadn't thought that up in Vietnam or watching Westmoreland. From 1964 to 1967, General Abrams had been the Vice Chief of Staff of the United States Army, and the Chief of Staff had been a general named Harold K. Johnson. Early in General Westmoreland's tenure in Vietnam, General Johnson had visited and come home very unhappy with what he saw.
General Johnson commissioned a small study group of officers with experience in Vietnam to evaluate the U.S. Army's effectiveness. Their study was called PROVEN, Program for the Pacification and Long-Term Development of Vietnam. The officers came to a startling conclusion.
The way General Westmoreland is conducting the war in Vietnam is not working and cannot work. And the major reason, in their view, was it was ignoring the infrastructure in the villages. And the study said that is where the war and the object behind the war lies, in the hamlets and villages of South Vietnam. And then they laid out a whole scheme of how that kind of war could and should be prosecuted.
General Abrams was deeply aware of the complexity of the war, that there was the main force war with the big North Vietnamese regiments out there in the jungle, and then there were the Viet Cong here and there, and little sapper squads, but more important than that, that the whole Viet Cong political, economic, and propaganda apparatus was part of a web, and one had to understand that.
Soon after Tet of '68, it is announced that General Westmoreland is coming back, leaving Vietnam and going to become the Army Chief of Staff. And soon after that announced that General Abrams will succeed him. Abrams sends a message to General Harold K. Johnson, still the Chief of Staff, and he asks him to send out an officer named Don Marshall, a colonel. Interesting man, reserve officer, PhD anthropologist from Harvard, and a very smart man. And he had been a key player on the Proven study. And Abrams asked for him to be assigned to Vietnam, and General Johnson, of course, quickly agrees. Abrams sends a message to Marshall and says he's looking forward to him. He says, "You will need your notes," meaning the results of the Proven study. And he makes him his long-range planner, and they proceed to implement Proven several years after it had been devised, but the first opportunity had to do so.
So now, managing the Allied effort in Vietnam, we had the CORD civilian organization under Ambassador Colby, the embassy run by Ambassador Ellsworth Bunker, and the new military approach under General Creighton Abrams. For the first time in American history, civilian and military personnel were about to fight a new kind of war, together. The Communists had made a major tactical error, resulting in the loss of their support in the South. In the wake of their attacks, General Westmoreland was replaced and General Abrams took command of American forces in Vietnam. The prospects for a one-war military and political approach received new emphasis almost immediately.
General Fred Wyand, who was serving there then at a senior level and had served under Westmoreland, said that the tactics changed within 15 minutes of Abrams taking command. And my conclusion is that General Abrams changed everything he could. So now the measure of merit is no longer body count, which General Abrams said was irrelevant anyway. If you want to talk about a stark difference in outlook between him and his predecessor, that's it right there. It is now the percentage of the population's living in secure environment.
General Abrams did a wonderful thing in making clear to the U.S. Army up and down the length of South Vietnam that it was their duty to, in their words, get with pacification. I send my medics into the village once a week to put Band-Aids on the children and so on. Well, that was nice, and they did it well, and it was well worth doing, but the view of General Abrams is much more sophisticated than that. And to illustrate it, let me tell you a story. I was at a meeting at MACV once. Somehow the subject of parachutes came up, and he, as a famous tank officer, said to the group, well, you know, I know you can do all kinds of wonderful things with parachutes. You can drop soldiers with parachutes, weapons with parachutes. You could probably drop an officers club with a parachute, with many parachutes. But you know what a parachute is really useful for in this war? For these units to spread it on the ground and have a picnic with the nearest Vietnamese village chief and ask him whether the Viet Cong are taxing in the village, whether there's a midwife, whether the school is open, whether there's any medical support at all, what the black market price for fertilizer is, and then they'd begin to understand what this war is all about. Well, you know, to hear a four-star tough general like General Abrams saying that, it really woke up the other generals who, it opened their minds to the fact that this war was extraordinarily complex, and that the kind of information, indeed, that one needed was more than where are they, and we go shoot at them.
Not only did the American military take a revised approach under their new commander, the South Vietnamese were motivated to improve their entire military structure as well.
So what you had was a renewed effort to try to take back control, and what the South Vietnamese did was they got rid of a lot of their worst provincial officials, the people who were in charge of the different provinces, put in new people. They strengthened their local militia forces, and these were people who were either living in a province and would go to wherever hotspot there was, or they were people who were actually living in a village full-time, which was a very effective technique because the communists depended on their access to the population. They went to the people to recruit them, they went there to get intelligence, they went there to get rice. So they started shutting off the communist access to the villages. When you combine that with the losses that the communists suffered in the Tet Offensive, you have a major drop-off in the capabilities of the revolutionary movement within South Vietnam.
You could tell from the message traffic that they were in deep trouble. We are just a few days away from running out of food. They would say, we need help. The locals will not support us anymore. You have got to come. You, North Vietnamese Army, have got to come and help us.
On the Cord's civilian side, Ambassador Whitehouse worked closely with his Vietnamese counterpart, General Tree, as well as the American military.
And so there was a lot of patchwork done between the regular U.S. units in the field and my guys and the Vietnamese. And the Vietnamese on their side, I remember discussing schools often with Tree, and he was very imaginative, and he arranged for the militia people in particular villages to be checked out and see if there were any school teachers or people with that kind of a background in them, and then we would open a school with the American bulldozer making a flat place, an American truck bringing some uprights, the local village thatching the roof, somebody producing some black paint to make a blackboard, and the Vietnamese producing 2 soldiers who were taken off military duties to be the school teachers, while back in Saigon, the Ministry of Education was scratching its head and wondering if they could find anybody who would want to go to this remote, lonely, and dangerous place. So the whole Accords and pacification effort brought tremendous help to the population with improvisation.
As that took place, we were able to secure the villages. The people now lived without Viet Cong interference in their village life, and things began to look sort of normal, even to them, people who had been at war since World War II, as a matter of fact.
The pacification program that was instituted in late '67, interrupted by Tet, and reinstituted as an accelerated pacification program in '68 and '69, had produced great results. I was stunned, really surprised when I got back in Vietnam at that period at how much better off things were. The road to Vitan, which we would never have thought about going out to Vitan in a Jeep, it was pacified. You could get in a Jeep and drive to Vitan.
That story was repeated all over South Vietnam as the War of Pacification under General Abrams took hold. General Sam Cockerham controlled all 5,000 Army aircraft in Vietnam.
My units could move anytime with ease throughout Vietnam, day or night, rain or shine. And we did that simply because of the effectiveness of the U.S. ground forces supported by the U.S. Air Force. And I'd have to say with the effectiveness of the ARVN, that is the Army of Vietnam, and that we could move with ease. Now what am I saying? I'm saying that from my point of view, that my commanders were never actually stopped because of enemy action. We did engage the enemy, but we were always in control. Now this is a period again, 1969, 1970, and 1971.
Over the years, I'd say latter part of 68, especially 69, 70, the infrastructure was largely either driven out or rooted out. And then the quality of life in Vietnam just changed dramatically. The economy rebounded. People were happier. Their allegiance to their government, because of gratitude for this, increased very substantially. And that was the period when you could say the war began to be won.
So by 1970, the Communists had lost their support in the South, and the Allies were filled with new resolve. Most importantly, life was getting back to normal in the South Vietnamese countryside. The myth of American failure in the face of facts to the contrary spread to other aspects of the conflict as well. Beginning with Eisenhower, growing under Kennedy, and exploding under Johnson, the war was now being guided by a fourth American president, Richard Nixon, leading to some confusion over what we were trying to achieve. However, the military leadership, especially under General Abrams, had definite ideas about their mission.
You could argue that at the national level, we really never set our goals and objectives in Vietnam. Abrams, by contrast, was never in any doubt as to what the mission was. The mission was to get the South Vietnamese to the point where, if we kept up the promised support, they could sustain themselves, their independence, and their freedom. When Fred Wyand, whom I mentioned earlier, came back out to Vietnam in the summer of 1970 to be the deputy to Abrams, who's, of course, now commanding, and they were very close and very good friends. Two very fine men. Fred Wyand said to General Abrams, "What's the mission?" And Abrams says, meaning the national mission, Abrams says, "Who the hell knows? I know what needs to be done. You know what needs to be done. Let's get on with it."
By 1971, hundreds of thousands of American soldiers had been withdrawn, leaving the South Vietnamese alone to fight for their freedom. Were they lesser soldiers than the Americans and less motivated than the Communists? Or was this just another of the many myths about the war? General Edward C. Meyer served a combat tour in Vietnam and later became Army Chief of Staff.
In the early stages of our involvement in Vietnam, I do not believe that the hierarchy of the United States Army that was over there felt that the Vietnamese could carry out the kind of missions that they would have to do if they were to be supported by our equipment and our troops. In my judgment, as I watched over time later on and went back in 1969 and 1970, after having been there in 65, 66 period, that was a false perception.
When General Abrams took command, he had two major challenges. One was to win the war on his terms, regaining and securing the countryside. The other was how to simultaneously withdraw American forces and turn over the entire war to the South Vietnamese soldiers. The answer to that challenge was called Vietnamization.
When General Abrams got over there, he really focused on Vietnamization. I mean, he pushed for the South for the active U.S. military over there to really help the South Vietnamese evolve into stronger combat forces. I was a brigade commander. In my headquarters, I had the brigade commander of an airborne brigade. We were side by side in there. He watched how we operated. I talked with him at night about what we did, and he talked with me about what they did. So we had the opportunity, in essence, to be helping train on the ground forces of our allies.
One must recall that many of the ARVN commanders had been fighting for a generation. And even among the younger soldiers, many had been fighting for the South since high school.
So they were weary. However, the tenacity of those soldiers is far beyond imagination because they did engage and they were effective. I'd like to leave a point that, from my point of view and what I observed, they did one hell of a good job.
There were some good, really quite good units, well-led, well-trained. Their families, we helped take care of their families in the little villages that they built around their military camps and so forth. They're good soldiers.
In addition to re-equipping the South Vietnamese regular forces, the Vietnamese president undertook an even more controversial plan.
President Thieu, the South Vietnamese president, against the advice of almost all his advisors who thought this was too risky, created what was called a People's Self-Defense Force, and he armed them. The anti-war people in the United States always wanted you to believe how unpopular the Thieu government was. But President Thieu recruited 4 million people into the People's Self-Defense Force and gave them 600,000 weapons, and not a one was ever turned against the government. So first of all, he knew his people, and secondly, they knew where their interests lay.
The withdrawal of American soldiers ordered by President Nixon had severely cut the number of friendly forces. However, Vietnamization and the new joint military and civilian approach to the war, even in the face of the American departure, had accomplished much.
The objective had been achieved of a free and independent South Vietnam capable of sustaining itself, so long as, and here's the crucial conditional, so long as the United States kept its obligations. And there came a point when the war was won. The fighting wasn't over, but the war was won.
The history of Vietnam spans 1,000 years. Wars had been fought and kingdoms won, perhaps 100-fold. In the course of human events, all is ephemeral. Thus, a victory that had defied all odds would soon evaporate. A victim of time and a changing world, it is only preserved now in the memory of the soldiers and the families of the fallen.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to help us produce more compelling historical content like this, please like, comment below, and share this video with fellow history buffs. And of course, be sure to subscribe to help keep history happening.